in this. Okay, now we are officially
Okay.
on.
All right. Okay.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for participating and attending this Open Tibet forum. This is our first online forum dedicated to discuss ideas on issues that relate to contemporary Tibetan history, professional development among exile communities, diaspora community. Open Tibet is a small group. We have a few members here attending this talk. Last year we organized event relating to bringing leaders from different career fields to talk about on on their career paths and lessons learned, and what advice they could share for the future generation, young generation of Tibetans. We also organized a talk on Tibet, contemporary development in Tibet. We invited scholars, activists, and individuals who work to preserve Tibetan culture here in North America, specifically in Canada. So this is we selected this topic because personally for me, I've read this, and I just have to give a shout out to High Peak Earths, who reviews books that comes out in relating to Tibet. So this was one of the book that they had highlighted a year back, like kind of suggested readings on Tibet, new publications. So High Peak Earths, they included this book, and I picked up this book because it's also a personal side of interest in this. Is my father was from Lhasa, and while growing up, he always used to share stories of going to Drebung Monastery as a monk, running down the hill, coming to Bakor, running the streets in Bakor. So, and he always had a passion for going, like many Tibetans, he always dreamt of going back to Tibet at this old age, and at least before he passed away. So he wanted to be there, be with his family, visit the monasteries, do the pilgrimage. So there was the personal element of my interest in this Lhasa, but also at the same time, I thought it's a good way to get more into details of what is Lhasa these days, what do you observe in Lhasa, and going beyond some of the flashy YouTube video channels. Speaking of whether it's from tourists who visit there, who wants to explore, at least get a taste of more like Shangri-La, what it is like a Shangri-La feel to it. So I think so. It was important when looking at this book to go beyond those images and what are the current developments, what are the people of Lhasa thinking, how are they going about through that change. So that's just a short context to this book, and Michael will be speaking more. So just a quick before we start, a very short bio of Mike. I'll give a short bio of Michael, and he'll fill in if there's any more additional information he would like to speak about his background, experience, knowledge. Michael will speak then. So Michael Aldrich, I'll give a very abbreviated short bio, and so Michael is an American career lawyer who's a dual citizenship with Taiwan and the United States. He has a background studies in East Asian studies and diplomatic history in the context of East Asia. He has worked as a lawyer helping out businesses in East Asia, Mongolia, China, where was Taiwan, helping explore business opportunities and supporting businesses grow in this region. He also has a very strong interest on Asian culture and history, and this can be seen clearly from the extent of research that he has done on Old Lhasa, because it's very fascinating when I read this book, when you go into detail on each sites and give a story of of each of these sites and how it relates to the broader history of Tibet and developments in Tibet. Both, and also how societies was evolving throughout this change when you looked at some of these sites. So, and I think so that's a very short bio, and I will let Michael to speak more on his background, why he chose to take on this research and write this very fascinating book on Old Lhasa. Sundu, if there's, and I'll let you, if there's anything else that you would like to fill in.
Okay, well, just by way of background, I've been living continuously in East and Central Asia since 1992. My interests in Tibet go back a long way. When the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, was first engaging in a number of international introductions, so to speak, overseas travel, he came to my university in 1979 to give a talk. And I attended that talk, and I was really mesmerized by him. His wit, his compassion, and his ability to connect with an audience. Most of the audience were young career diplomats, and he was not necessarily connecting with them, but those of us in the audience who had an affinity, broadly speaking, for Asian culture, he was connecting with us. So that was where the seed was planted, along with many other seeds. I spent many years studying Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese history, various aspects of Buddhism. I was going to get a PhD in East Asian history, but then I just realized that's a difficult path. I should perhaps pick something that would be easier. So I went to law school. That was something of a mistake. It wasn't easier, but it did allow me to have a career where I have lived continuously in East Asia, have been in a position to negotiate joint venture deals and other transactions with probably more PRC Chinese officials than anyone should ever be exposed to. I acquired a lot of scar tissue in the process of all that. And by being based in Asia, I was able to travel. And I've written several books about Beijing, other places in Asia, Beijing, Ulaanbaatar, where I lived for 6 years. I wrote a book about the Muslim community of Beijing. And for me, it was after writing about Mongolia, it was the next natural step to write about Lhasa. Now, I can't really claim any, strong credentials, paper credentials, in terms of being a Tibet expert. I'm simply not. I'm just someone with a very, very keen sense of curiosity and wish to learn. But at the same time, there's a certain hesitancy you have when, as such an outsider, you take on a project like this. And when I first wanted to write about Lhasa, I figured, it'll be a short book. I didn't realize I'd be winding up with something that was going to be, this large. But for me, there were two sources. After the book was published, there were two sources that provide me a lot of what you can say spiritual sustenance. One, I'm very grateful to Tenzi for his comments on the book when he first posted on Facebook, because this is the first time I heard from someone who is the ideal audience for the book and realizing I connected. Another time is more recent. I have, through friends of friends, there's a Tibetan man who married a Taiwanese woman. He is a PRC national. He lives in Lhasa. His wife at that time was teaching at Tibet University. They fell in love. They married. They face certain challenges insofar as they have to divide their time between Taiwan and Tibet. And he needs to get a whole series of rather nettlesome approvals to come to Taiwan. Anyway, his wife is friends of someone who teaches in the high school in the village where I live. So through that grapevine, we met. And his name is Dorji. And Dorji said, well, he liked my book. And he said, what he appeals to him is that I set out a narrative of the life of Lhasa from beginning to now. And he likened me to maybe one of these storytellers that you would have seen on the unpaved streets of Lhasa before the uninvited arrival of a hard modernity. Someone who would weave a story in which I would use the motif of Chenrezig's mission to bring compassion and the Dharma to people, to Tibet and the world at large. And that he's a fellow who hasn't been able to attend higher schooling in Tibet, but his affirmation was something that provided me with some modicum of confidence. Because all in all, I wanted to write a historical guide that gives voice to both legends and factual events, as in reference to Chenrezig's goal position as a patron for Tibetan universal compassion. Another goal was to write something so that other outsiders like myself could go to Lhasa and not only see things, because there's so much to see, and there's such a conceptual overload when you go to Lhasa in terms of the artwork. Just looking at that magnificent artwork behind Tenzing right now is a reflection of the cognitive overload of images that you have going to Lhasa. But I wanted to write something for outsiders who would be able to not only see these wonderful things, but also perhaps comprehend them. And I wanted to explain this not in sort of Sunday school language, but rather a more modern voice with a sense of wit. Because I think the only way you can get through 25 years of being a lawyer is having a very good sense of humor. And in all things, it's very important to apply that sense of humor to what you see and what goes on. So that's sort of the background for me writing this book. I would have to say, and it's fair, that as a whole, Lhasa is a disappointing place for most people. And that is because the authorities have turned it into a rather artless megacity. What you'll see is this modern construction that has expanded from the Jokong, both to the east and west, in places that used to be PLA barracks, now being turned into brutalist style architecture. I know after that recent movie, somehow brutalism is given sort of a plug. I say the name says it all. It's really unattractive architecture. Now, on this, I have to say, some Tibetan friends said, well, they really destroyed our city. And it's like, well, the authorities have destroyed all Chinese cities, to be frank. It's not necessarily hurtful punishment meted out purely to Tibetans. But most mainland Chinese cities are visually very unappealing. They're charmless. You have soulless shopping malls, traffic clogged streets. Cities are designed for the designer rather than the people who live there. I spent many years in Beijing and certainly experienced that. And occasionally there are faux Tibetan touches to the city that do not all necessarily always fail, but generally, the word authentic could not be applied to them. I should say, we should be on slide 3. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that if we can. Let's see. Here we are. These are two photos, one from the Potala Palace and the other from Pabonka Monastery to the north of the city. And what you see is what is the reality of most of modern Lhasa, which is not very inspiring. Now, there you go. In contrast so invariably when you see Lonely Planet and other guides, they often say, well, Lhasa is a grave disappointment. Well, I think all cities in the PRC, if you're looking to connect with the cultural past, are grave disappointments. It's a question of where you look and what you see. Next slide, please. And what, my point was to look at what I deemed as Old Lhasa, or the Tibetan Quarter, which is, a district at the heart of the city with Jokong as at its center. Traditionally, when one spoke of Lhasa, this is what was visualized. And all of these new concrete and steel growths surrounding this are recent additions. It's almost like looking at a jewel that's encrusted by barnacles or other growths that you have to chip away through in order to get to what was a precious cultural legacy from centuries. In many ways, I sort of describe in the book that Old Lhasa, this area, is a blend of the historic, the everyday, and the touristic. Next slide, please. The historic aspects, I think we would all be familiar with from literature written by both Tibetans and non-Tibetans. The historic aspects are usually religious sites, with the immutable faith of the Lhasans as a mainstay, along with a handful of secular sites that go back through the centuries. On the north side of the Barkar, for example, there is a magistrate's office, the Nangtisha, which goes back to the 15th century. It was still functioning until the 1950s. Across the street from it is Chomsikang, which is a 15th century government office. This is the place where the 6th Dalai Lama used to sit and watch Lhasan women dance in the evenings. The facade still remains, but others have been destroyed. But Old Lhasa has a continuation of these historic sites, some of whom are religious. Next slide, please. The everyday, which is for me the reason to go to Lhasa, the everyday aspects of people's lives. Of course, the artwork in the Jokong, the Potala, Drepung, Ganden are magnificent. The examples of people's faith going to the Nechung Oracle Temple are again very, very moving. But in particular, what I especially enjoyed was going and having contact with average Lhasans in places that don't really have any huge historical meaning in some ways for the scholar or for the academic, but are places where you can experience the rhythm of Lhasan life and with it feel the degree of extraordinary warmth that's extended to an outside visitor. It's a feist. Going to the everyday places is very feisty. People aren't shy. One of my favorite memories is one day I was waiting for a friend. We were on the Barkor South route of it. He was purchasing a Tonka, I think. And I was, just standing outside waiting for him. And this husband and wife came up, clearly from the countryside, very rustic in appearance, not very tall. And the fellow saw me, broke into a smile, and then he jumped up on this little porch right next to me so that he would be at the same height as me. And he started looking around as to say, so that's what it looks like for you from up there, right? Yeah, I smiled, and he came down the porch, and then I in turn squatted so I would be at the same height as him. I look around, so this is what it looks like for you down here, right? Which is a sort of cheekiness and feistiness that I love. It's something that I, based on my years of experience, I associate as being a very, very Central Asian way of interacting with someone who's obviously from out of town, right? And all the others in my group fell in love with Lhasans and Tibetans for the same reason, that sort of candid, unpretentious, feisty cheekiness, which you can't help, I think, as a non-Tibetan, fall in love with. Anyway, the next slide. And then in addition to the historic and the everyday, we have the touristic, which I think we all sort of innately in this era have a reaction against excessive tourism. And sadly, Lhasa, because of its legendary status, cannot avoid. Nonetheless, there are certain things about the touristic that is positive, such as on the left and right sides of the slide are tourist shops selling stuff, but being sold by Lhasans rather than outsiders. One can't say that for many places that are of touristic importance in the People's Republic. You go to Yunnan province and the locals aren't running anything that you see in Lijiang and other such places. Of course, one has to deal with, I guess you can say, the Orientalism of mainland Chinese tourists who like to get dressed up as Tibetan ladies and so forth. But in some ways, I take this as a slightly positive development compared to looking over the past 40 years when Tibetans would be punished for having green brains because they would wear traditional clothing. Now we see Han Chinese viewing Tibetan clothing as fashionable. Well, this may not be a very deep compassion or understanding, but it's sure a heck of a lot better than what we were having to deal with 50 years ago. Next slide, please. So what you come across in Lhasa, in Old Lhasa, is this, combination, this connections between the new and the old, which certainly does not fit with the Shangri-La images that many people have from reading the books of Heinrich Harrer or Alexander David Neal and so forth. But at the same time, it is also a mixture of past and present, which, as this one scene here presents, well, the Bar Khor now is a paved road, unlike for centuries and centuries it was unpaved. You have these new street lamps set up to look like prayer wheels, which really sort of underwhelm me. Same time, you have an attempt at trying to recreate traditional Tibetan architecture in the buildings on either side, which I guess in some ways serves touristic purposes, but is still better than having a shopping mall, or some other uninvited architectural inspiration into Lhasa. Now, certainly there are those who, I guess, complain, well, but it's not really Old Lhasa because we have people selling lattes and people renting clothes. It's like, well, there's no city in the world that is the same as it was 80 years ago. And if there is, I don't think any of us would really be all that comfortable in going to it. So some of these changes, some of these things are unavoidable, but it's important to be able to look at a particular scene like this and see the old with the new, to see this fellow, I think he was a Kampa, doing his prostrations around the Chokong as an example of extraordinary resilience, that no matter how much these material things will change over time, and a good Buddhist will know all these material things are examples of impermanence, there is a continuity with the past, a splendid resilience. Okay, next slide. Now, there's also, I guess you can say, compared to descriptions of the past, there's something of an imposed busyness to Lhasa, right? The Bar Khor would be crowded with street vendors in its day, setting up little lean-tos. Well, that's all disappeared. There are paved streets, and they're paved poorly. These streets cause tremendous flooding, which is the case, I think, with all Chinese cities, except one, Qingdao. Qingdao has a great wastewater management system. Why? The Germans made it 120 years ago, sort of an indictment against modern mainland engineering principles. So there's a crowdedness that is a reflection of its development, but at least there are still measures or things done to bring about little vignettes that touched in the past. And happily, there are things like these street benches where the elderly can gather and sit down and watch people as they go by, which is a sight that brings to mind an older and less brutal time for Lhasa. Tenzi and Tsunti were talking earlier about, all these YouTube clips that people are now, basically these shills are putting up about, well, I'm a far and I went to Lhasa and I think it's fantastic. It looks really wonderful what the Chinese have done. These improvements are really underwhelming. I mean, simply much of the improvements include a horrible construction using cement blocks rather than the traditional way of Lhasa houses, which would be made out of a combination of stone and mud and stone mixtures. Right. The modern the old houses were built in sort of a trapezoid shape in order to take best advantage of sunlight. The windows were always trapezoid shape rather than these rectangles that we see here. These were all very, very carefully designed housing to make people comfortable. The cement blocks construction aren't comfortable. And that was one thing that time and again from many Tibetans, touching the topic and bam, there's the next 20 minutes gone, talking about how much they hate this modern architectural materials. It may look Tibetan, it may be comfortable, it may look comfortable, but it's not. You have invariably other YouTubers. I remember one guy in particular going on and on about, well, they say there's no freedom of religion in Tibet. I went here and everywhere I looked, I saw examples of religion. Well, that's pretty underwhelming. That's like saying, oh, I went into a bookshop and they had books there. That means they have freedom of the press, right? I asked someone how they're feeling today. They say, oh, they're feeling fine. That shows original thought. I guess there's freedom of thought in Tibet as well. These sorts of things are that I think are increasing on YouTube, to my experience, are so utterly shallow. They're obviously United Front Works Department projects, and they make some impact. But ultimately, the boasts of the PRC about what they've done in Lhasa since 1951 are very, very shallow. See, next slide. Now, Tenzi asked me to say, well, spend a few moments describing of what it feels like to be in Lhasa. And as I mentioned a few moments earlier, there's a heartwarming acceptance of the outsider. And that is something that is overwhelmingly attractive. You'll have direct eye contact with people, which is something that if you, I don't know, go to Japan, places in mainland China, you're not going to experience that. And it's not only direct eye contact, but you'll have twinkling eyes and broad smiles and a gracious welcome. To some extent, when they see the arch of my nose, they sort of realize I'm an ally. All right, if I'm coming to their country, it's because I'm with you. But I think also there's just a genuine warmth and outgoingness that is extremely appealing after East Asian shyness, I would say. That was very similar to my experiences in the sovereign state of Mongolia and why I love living there so much. I can give a slight reading about how all of this evolved in one very, very memorable vignette. I once left my hotel around 5:30 to take an early morning stroll through the Tibetan quarter. I zigged and zagged my way through the streets until I came to the bar corps at the southeast prayer flagpole. In pre-dawn twilight, the bark represented a timeless spectacle. Hundreds of pilgrims were completing the circuit as large, bottle-shaped censers emitted massive clouds of burning juniper incense, which scented the air with its perfumes. The stars and the moon shone brightly overhead, while the eastern sky began to change from Bible black to purplish blue with smears of apple blossom pink. Scores of people prostrated themselves along the Barhor, and there was a constant buzzing hum of Om Mani Padme Om. I joined the petitioners and circled the Jokong to its northern end, continually being welcomed and met with warmth. Pilgrims raised their right hand in a gesture of approval. One wizened woman, cackling merrily, came up to me, rubbed my shoulder in affection, and then stuck out her tongue, which, as we know, is an arcane gesture to show respect. I replied in kind, and hopefully I made the old lady's day, gave her something to talk about with her family over dinner that night. Eventually, I passed a 15th century courthouse where an incense burner released columns of scented smoke, and the mani wheels were working at full speed, and then turned right into an alley to Mero Ningba Monastery. People were streaming into the courtyard following a complicated quorum to the sites of worship. It was a mid-sized, mixed temple residential courtyard thronging with worshipers. I eventually got to the entranceway and I stumbled up the stairs to the main temple. A monk sounding a drum by the side of the right entrance greeted me with a huge smile and waved me in. As before, none of the Tibetans batted an eyelid about someone so non-visibly Tibetan joining their devotions. I clambered up a perilously steep and slippery staircase, nearly tripping. Numerous hands reached out to steady me. On the second floor, there was an ornate chapel for the monastery's guardian protectors and a throng of worshippers who swept me up with them encircling the altars. I made my way out of the Barhor to complete my circumambulation and then went back to the hotel. An experience such as this is why non-Tibetans ought to come to Lhasa. So the issues of warmth, I think there's this particular monk, Lama, befriended me while I was in the Norbolinka. And through the guy, we started having this fabulous exchange. He, as Tibetans sometimes do, when they meet someone where they feel an affinity, declare, oh, we must have been friends in a prior life. You had to have been Tibetan before. That's why we're getting along so well. We kept on chatting. He embraced me several times. While we were talking, several PLA soldiers then marched by, swinging their truncheons. And my monk looked at them and sort of laughed, imitating them swinging their truncheons. And everyone else was looking at these guys, humorously, seeing them mistake force for moral authority. On the right-hand side is Songgampo's meditation cave in Baponka to the north of the city. Now, I didn't take this picture and I didn't expect it to be taken. It's a little too showy in some ways, or a little too narcissistic for me to want a photo like this. But a friend of my group took that photo, and in it sort of reflects the utterly accepting approach that the sacristan monks had when I was there. Because I simply can't imagine something necessarily being properly done in a Mahayana Chinese Buddhist temple in the mainland. In most places in the mainland, Buddhism is meant to be for Chinese people, and one's presence is a cause of suspicion. So this absence of shyness, there's even at times flirtatiousness. Middle-aged Tibetan women would give me a lot of attention. I would hear them speaking among themselves, then asking, practicing the Chinese phrase, "Hey, are you married?" Right, which came as a pleasant shock. I'm a 65-year-old kind of overweight white guy. And being hit up like that, I was like, wow, it makes me feel as if I'm physically fit. But that sort of cheekiness. I mean, there's very rapidly an unspoken solidarity that comes about when the outsider shows himself to be with them. I guess next slide 11. Yeah, that what I feel rather strongly in the course of my visits. I mean, invariably, when you read the Western press, the commentary, the thoughts are, well, time's running out. Tibet will soon disappear. It will be replaced by China, Chinese culture. And I don't quite share the journalist's viewpoint insofar as wherever I went, I would feel this extraordinary sense of resilience. And within the context permitted by the authorities, you would find examples of an acceptance, a preservation of the past. The photos of this Aceh Lama, which I just love. I'm an old man and I have old man tastes, and I love taking opera. I love Aceh Lama. I love Zen flute music. These sessions were just electric with enthusiasm, and I was able to get librettos for the stories, so I had an idea of what was going on. But just the enthusiasm, the electricity, the energy felt by the people, preserving this tradition, despite all the approvals, all the surveillance, and all the procedures that they have to comply with. I was wanted to also speak about my impressions very briefly of the other tourists or non-Tibetans who arrive. Now, I'm very strongly of the view that while one can be very, very angry, justifiably, at the PRC, this should never slip into xenophobia or dislike of Chinese people because of what their government does. I'm an American. I certainly hope no one's going to hate me for what my government's doing these days. I definitely hope so. I have an especially fond memory of Rinpoche Temple. I went in the queue to pay my respects to Belza's dowry. The crowd jostled up against me, and a young Chinese man was beaming at me in adoration of the Mikyo Dorji. He recognized my little group of foreigners as sharing his reverence and asked, "Isn't Tibetan Buddhism wonderful?" It was a welcomed and delightful countermeasure to the Han supremacy so often on display in the People's Republic. I said, "Indeed, it is, my friend," as his face lit up in a shining smile. The positive energy of that exchange has stayed with me ever since, like a mindfully executed spin of a prayer wheel. Now, there are other, and I'd have to say over the years, I've seen Chinese tourists go from not being very impressive in their behavior to being respectful, not necessarily comprehending. I think in many ways, they feel the betrayals of government policy and are turning to spirituality. And while they may not have a really deep understanding of Tibetan Buddhism, many of them certainly demonstrate respect as civilians. Government officials are a different matter, and they're invariably the sort of type that creates deep irritation. I remember on my last stay in Lhasa last year, my group was sitting at a restaurant, and next to us was this woman who was obviously a very highly placed cadre. She was kind of like dumpy, sort of shaped like a dumpling with a real bad haircut, right? And she's there talking away with her minions, pointing at us, saying, "Oh, these foreigners, they're terrible. The only thing, they're all homosexuals. The only thing they do is smoke marijuana, and their goal is to try to break up China. They're really terrible," right? which was a very good, hearing her was a very good reminder of the official attitude that exists. She never thought we could understand her. So being somewhat mischievous, I couldn't help but respond by blowing a kiss at her, just to kind of let her know, yeah, I got you. I hear what you're saying. So, so the impressions of Chinese vary. Foreigners, I have a mixed feeling about. The honorable exceptions are Japanese, Koreans, Hong Kong Chinese, and Taiwanese. And this is something that my guides have reaffirmed time and again. These guys, these sorts of foreigners are are very reverential and are here to learn. In terms of Euro-American tourists, they seem to be approaching Lhasa as a bucket list trip, right? It's a famous place that you have to go to, whether to show how sophisticated and well-traveled you are. And that combined with consumerism with a globalist flair. I mean, you have a Burger King around the corner from the Jokong these days, are sort of disturbing things. But another, going back to Tenzing's question about how does it feel, one thing that is constant is if you're paying attention to it, is how people have a crippling absence of information about Tibetan history and civilization. On the east side of Marpo Li, the mountain where the Potala Palace is located, you have a nunnery. It's called Karna Dong Nunnery. And it contains a number of 7th century stone carvings that had been part of one of the positional Rigsum protector temples built by Songtsen Gampo. This thing was torn apart in the 50s. The carvings were used for a bridge. Eventually, they were recovered and they were replaced in this nunnery. And the nuns, had no idea of the origins of these things. And my guide sort of brought me out and sort of said, well, Mike, can you talk about this? It's like, well, it's me, it's Mike, I'm an outsider. Okay, well, as far as I know, this is the origins of these things. And the reaction of the nuns were just, I mean, Tibetan nuns are superb, where it's just very, very warm, very happy to be able to get affirmation from an outsider who would have access to materials that they are denied. And it was both, I felt blessed to be able to have the opportunity to confirm their understanding. And at the same time, there is this feeling of this crippling lack of information. Last year, one of my guides, we went to Ganden Monastery, and there was a chapel that contained a depiction of the 16 arhats. Some say 18, but 16 arhats. And one of them was labeled as Mohayen, right? And my guide said, this really confuses me because, what I do know of Tibetan history, Mohayen was the name of a Chinese Zen monk who debated Shantarakshita and at that great conference, that great debate held at Samye Monastery. How is it that this statue of him is placed with all these great arhats of the Buddha? And I said, well, hold on here. I mean, different names are going to be applied in different ways. And in essence, though the names are the same, these are two different entities. Mohayen is a stylized name of one of the Buddha's original arhats, entirely distinct from this other dude who lost the debate, right? And that led to a discussion about, well, gee, it's so hard to be able to track down these things or even ask these sorts of questions, because even the people who are the scholars who's supposed to know, even they may be Tibetan, won't have access to these things, which is always a crippling thing to have happen when you realize that here in my little corner of Taiwan, I can put together a little library on Tibetan materials that exceeds whatever can be found in Lhasa. That's outrageous, but that is the reality, unfortunately. Next slide. Now, so this is sort of comes to somewhat of the end of the photographs. I have another selection that I'll go through with you in a bit, but I wanted to sort of throw things open to conversation. I'd love for this to be interactive. I know I have been taking the lead a little too strongly, perhaps, and I'd be happy to have people chime in. But you know, we've already talked about the characters of visitors and the crippling absence of information. Tenzing asked me to comment a little bit on Tibetan young people, Lhasan young people. And their lifestyle, as far as I can see, is pretty much similar to what you see with Asian youth anywhere else in the world, in terms of the attraction of social media, in terms of modern music, in terms of the questions facing them and how you get ahead in life. There is a religious devotion uniformly, but it generally tends to be not really well structured in understanding. Sort of reminds me of Italian kids in Brooklyn, right, who would be sort of going to Catholic school and church, but not necessarily understanding significant issues of the faith and of spirituality. I think one of the real problems is, for them is career prospects, because there is an apartheid, there is a glass ceiling. There are people who've worked for decades as guides, and they're still listed as inexperienced guides, junior guides, for example. And the avenues for some sort of position going higher up into government service really is not there. What does usually open up for them would be vocational colleges in the mainland. Right, so Peking University is not really an option unless their family has contacts. So it's 3-year vocational schools where you learn something like logistics or machinery, machine engineering, or something like that, which clearly places one into, at best, lower middle class strata within Lhasan society. The need to speak Mandarin is inevitable. And in some ways, it winds up being an important lingua franca for many Tibetans who are pursuing vocational school in the mainland. In that, I know one example, a fellow who raised his son in Lhasa wound up in a vocational school in Guangzhou. There were two other Tibetan students. One was from Amdo, and the other was a Kampa. So yeah, Amdo, a Lhasan, and a Kampa, and they have to use Mandarin as the common language because their dialects are so remarkably different. And that, I think, reflects one of the disturbing aspects, but also a necessarily unavoidable aspect, that there will be an infusion of Chinese language, concepts, pop culture, technology, what have you, that invariably will become part of the lives of young Tibetans as they pursue careers. And I know that there are times among some in the Tibetan diaspora that they'll be, looking at people who have become somewhat Sinified, askance. But I really look at that and say, what's the alternative? Impoverishment. You have to make your deal with society as it is to try to advance and take care of your family. Invariably, I found that there's extreme thirst for overseas exposure. And all of the Tibetans I met, either I could speak with them directly in English or directly in Chinese or through my interpreter or my guide, expresses thirst for overseas exposure and for passports. You know, they really, really have this extraordinary desire. And I know one man who's been applying for a passport for 24 years, and each time it's rejected. And no excuse is given. No reason is given. There is no excuse, in my view. And in particular, that is a harshness that comes about because I think there's also a belief by doing this, this also somehow injures India because so many people want a passport so they can visit India. Either they have relatives in the monasteries there or in the communities or what have you. And I can see a Chinese view of saying, well, we're not going to give India the propaganda advantage of letting people go there because everyone loves India, which again is just blood-chillingly mean in its viewpoint. The last point I have on this one is the boarding school problem. And I know that gets a lot of attention in the Western media. I have to confess, I try to get some sort of information from people. The information I got was terribly inconsistent, right? Now people would tell different stories. Some would say, well, these schools are near urban areas, so the kids can go back to their parents on weekends. That's not a problem. They still learn Tibetan. Other people told me, no, the basic idea has justification looking at the rural areas where you have nomads spread such great distances. It makes sense to bring children together in a boarding school for education. But that is in turn used as a means of depriving them of their native language and their ability to appreciate their customs, their religion. My general feeling is that of all the things I wanted to talk about with the people I met, and on this last trip, I went to Kongpo, which again is quite different from Utsang. They didn't, I gathered finally, it was a very highly sensitive topic that you don't really want to talk about with an outsider. Either that reflects that the government policy is inconsistent, or that it's just too hot to handle. Someone might express views about His Holiness. Someone might express views about the Shugden controversy, right? But this was something which I couldn't really generate a meaningful discussion on. So I leaned back and say, I really don't know what the circumstances are. I'm not going to be a sap and say the impetus for this policy is the PRC's benevolence. Please, no. But the exact specifics of how this is being implemented is something that I really don't, I can't comment on. But maybe the next slide, if we may. These are again tend to ask me to put down a few of my thoughts about diaspora issues, and occasionally I've met Tibetans in the United States who in many ways are more American than I can ever be, but they insist, well, I'm Tibetan. You can take a DNA test and that proves it, right? Well, is that really sufficient in order to, is being Tibetan sufficient as a stasis objective for people who live in a diaspora. And my own feelings go back to concepts of my education many, many years ago, to address the issues of various civilizations and their complexities. And when I started doing my research for this book, I didn't have an idea. Like, most gringos, you're going to think, well, Tibet, it's, the Padre Lama, Potala Palace, it's the Dalai Lama, it's desert-like, right? And everyone will speak the same dialect. You eventually be like, no, of course not. Or well, gee, the differences. Heard about the Shugden controversy. Have you heard about the Bonpa, right? Have in terms of the great extent of what is Greater Tibet and the variety that exists there. All of this indicates that the phrase, as I have in this book, Tibetan civilization, is really critical. A civilization involves a plethora of ideas, languages, concepts, and so forth. And one thing that I find, I love the guy who wrote this, Rolf Stein. He wrote this 50 years ago. Is to bring out the idea of, no, there is a civilization. As no one doubts there's Chinese civilization, or Japanese civilization, or Russian civilization. Well, but there is a Tibetan civilization as well that isn't fully developed yet as something understood in the outside world. And I think one of the things that come with this is, I think, a need to have an intellectual framework for understanding the past. And this is, I think, a reflection of my own Jesuit education, because you don't get out of a Jesuit university without really being pounded on the history of Western civ, Western philosophy, political science. You get this framework. Now, there is sometimes this reaction where people say, well, we have to just decolonize these frameworks because it's, too Western in their focus. And I'm like, well, I don't like the word decolonize, because that sort of implies you're pushing things out that may be of value. What is valuable is to have an expansion of that framework, so that you have a framework that understands the Western tradition, the Chinese tradition, and the Tibetan tradition. And this was something that, again, I didn't really anticipate when I sort of blundered into writing this tome, but this would be one of the byproducts. And I would have that not as a scholar or an academic who makes my career off of teaching about Tibet, but in terms of my own personal benefits, my own personal understanding. Invariably there's this sort of California Buddhism that, California Buddhists who get really into, respecting Tibetan Buddhism without, a more colorful reflection of the mischievous nature of the great Tibetan yogis like Milarepa or Tantong, who's one of my absolute favorites. And that this, or just the disrespect for misused authority on the part of high lamas is something that I appeals to me to no end. So having that sort of framework, I think for people who live in the diaspora, means not only are you Tibetan, but you have a point of reference in terms of being able to understand the past and in that way preserve it. And again, I am hesitant to say these sorts of things because insofar as I'm an outsider, who am I to make any suggestions? I'm nobody. But I do believe that my experiences with folks that I met in Tibet reflect the critical need of having that framework, which is denied them in Tibet and which is available to Tibetans in the diaspora, and to seize that and to construct this intellectual framework, cultural framework for viewing the past. And I feel that applies to so many things, whether you talk about, the Abrahamic faiths, right? You need to have a framework and also need to have a certain humility about one's knowledge of the future. Because invariably, I get this more from non-Tibetans, but invariably someone who will say, well, it's, defeatism. we're done, we're toast. You know, we can't resist this. And my reaction is, well, no, just look at history. Imagine yourself suddenly becoming an invisible, disembodied spirit floating through the death camps of Auschwitz or Belsen in 1944. Would you ever possibly suspect that in 4 years' time there would be a state of Israel? It would be impossible to conceive of that. So, in terms of what the future may hold for Tibet, it is, obviously Tibetans aren't facing the utter brutishness of the Nazis, because ultimately I think the Chinese communists are squeamish about large scale genocide. But nevertheless, the situation can look dire, but we don't know what the end results will be further down the road. And I take great faith in the resilience of the Tibetans I've met. And I put my faith in Chenrezig's, sorry, my pronunciation's terrible, Chenrezig's mission to save Tibet. I mean, ultimately, it hasn't worked because he cannot overcome the karmic results of individual people. Chenrezig is not God in the Western sense. And if things have not worked well, that's in some ways a reflection of karmic aspects of what's gone on in Tibet in the past. But I refuse to accept the idea that it's all, that's out of luck. Dead out of, it's not going to happen at any point. Something will happen. There will be a resilience. And on that point, I'd like to jump to the slide 14, I guess it is. These are my usual concluding comments when I give a talk on my book. And I sort of painstakingly put together modern and old photographs to illustrate these ideas. But as I've indicated in my book, the Lhasans are the key players, of course. Lhasans are the reason why you go to Lhasa. Even if it was a modernistic, brutal as hellhole, you go to Lhasa for the people. So, set aside all the stupendous sites and its moving history. Tibetans are the most compelling reason for a trip anywhere in Tibet, or the reason to write about the country. Next slide. And as people have said, the most memorable aspect of travel is the people you meet along the way. And just combining the appearance of these folks walking in the bar corps in 1942 with the people attending the Ache Lama performances. Next slide. In trying to put this book together, I was able to connect, albeit briefly, with an endearing, tough, cheeky, feisty, stubborn, at times argumentative people who are invincible. Next slide. And to relate a story that connects those living today with those who lived there long ago. Next slide. I can think of no better way to close this talk than by quoting the American journalist Alex Shomantoff. Next slide. You wouldn't have guessed it from the high spirits of the Tibetans. He wrote this in 1990. You wouldn't have guessed it from the high spirits of the Tibetans, what they have been through, or that they are living in a very ugly police state. Next slide. When Tibetans smile, like this one guy here holding this large tongue, when Tibetans smile, their eyes widen, the skin draws back, and their whole face expands and lights up like a bulb. Next slide. Contentment and untroubled clarity radiate from their features. Next slide. Maybe because of their practice of a system of overcoming suffering, the suffering of existence, that the Hindu prince Siddhartha worked out 2,500 years ago. Next slide. Indeed, I deeply believe the Tibetans will overcome this current cycle of darkness, as they have in past years. I'm thinking of Lang Dharma. I'm thinking of the collapse after the sixth Dalai Lama, just as they've overcome all other bleak periods in their history. So to put together this book, it was, I don't know, something like an offering of a yak butter lamp. It was for the light of this lamp that I dared, as a non-Tibetan, to write it, and hopefully have it looked upon positively by people who know more and are more authentic than I am. Next slide. I promised my friend that I would give him credit for his photographs. I'm a terrible photographer. And then the last slide is a plug for my book, which is sadly only available through Amazon, alas. The publisher is not able to fill online orders. But anyway, there you have it. I'd be happy to take any questions, thoughts, criticisms, disagreements. Please lead me forward.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I have your book here. And I think so. It's for me, after reading this, your book, it got me more interested into reading more on Tibet, on the history, but also surrounding Tibet in the context of in the context of broader Himalayan region also. Right? So
Yep.
I think so. It's because the history is so intertwined with relation with other regions, Nepal,
Absolutely.
Tibet. So first of all, I just want to say thank you very much. It is, for me personally, it has really increased my interest and the need and thirst to read more. And for personally for me as a diaspora Tibetan who always wish to go back to Tibet, visit my family members, it's a small way to gain some satisfaction internally by reading your book and see, even though it's one way avenue for me to really understand Tibet in all this complexity. So first of all, thank you very much, and I really appreciate.
Oh, the pleasure is absolutely mine. And I guess one last thought about having what I call the cultural and intellectual framework is essential when one is dealing with people who are apologists for the CCP, because they'll come out with a whole bunch of rubbish, right? Tibet's always been part of China and so forth. And in encountering those sorts of discussions, if you have the intellectual framework and perhaps a mean disposition, I was a lawyer after all for 25 years. It's great in terms of being able to rip into that nonsense and demonstrate your point very, very much. And then there are other aspects. I mean, here's one book I mentioned. It's called The Adventures of a Tibetan Fighting Monk. And it's a memoir of a Dabdab who was in Tibet in 1959. He fled to India, eventually wound up in England, where he became accepted in an English village and was welcomed every day in the local pub. They called him Charlie, right? But this is a book written from the viewpoint of someone who is a family background. A lot of histories, memoirs are written by people of the elite. This is written by a Tibetan dude, an average guy who had this extraordinary experience, and I love it. I can't recommend this book enough to people because he just conveys so well. I'll start butchering my phrase. I like it so much I can't find the words for it, but and others as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be simply guys like Rolf Steen. We Tibetans, written by a calm woman in 1920s, it's also a great read because she was taking aim at all the misunderstandings that Westerners had about Tibet. Now, oh, you say that we never knew about the wheel. Don't you look at the top of our temples and monasteries? There's an 8-spoke wheel. Yeah, we kind of knew about it for a long time, you dummies. So to have feisty records like this, as I said, I'd be happy to I'm always around to bounce off ideas or discussions or anything because you've paid me such a great honor to speak to your group tonight. Count me in.
And if I may, I just wanted to real quickly thank you, Michael. I was actually, yeah, it was quite emotional and very insightful. As a Tibetan, I was born in India, so I've never been to Tibet. I've only heard through books and through videos. Um, so it was actually very moving to see the pictures, to hear your insights, and I think I would agree with what Tenzin said as well, that you sort of capture, like, I think it's based on how open you went in, right? Inside Tibet. You didn't go in as a researcher or as in someone to like correct. Like you didn't have the intention to like just write something about it. Instead, you explored and you opened your heart to to the Tibetan people, and they did to you as well. And I really liked how you captured all of those moments of you sharing with the people. Like you were able to understand the warmth and all of those things. So it's very amazing. And I think you also provided us with a lot of insights. I think that framework, having as a Tibetan, because this is what we sort of wrestle with being in the diaspora. We also have the struggle of being assimilated to wherever countries we are in at this moment. And also, there's a danger of sort of forgetting in some ways.
It's
Yeah. And then we always try to question ourselves what makes you a Tibetan, right? It's not just the fact that you wear the Tibetan dress, it's not just the fact that you speak Tibetan, but then the knowledge is also important. And I think we have to definitely work in creating that essential intellectual framework that you mentioned about knowing our own histories and what makes it. And I think that will help us sustain. I had one question. I think you might have touched on it a little bit. So the most recent visit was actually last year, you said? I don't know if I
that's
heard you
right.
wrong. Wow, okay. You're so lucky. I feel like I can get a glimpse of Tibet right from you, and I can feel Tibet from you, which is a dream for most of us right now. But my question is, in terms of, so I do see like the whole synicization that's happening in terms of our language, like Mandarin is supposed to be the main language, and in terms of even the schools, right? Like you talked briefly about the boarding schools, but what about the monasteries, right? Because I know that Buddhism is one of the most correct essential resource for Tibetans, and it has been for a very long time. But I've heard things about how China, like the government, is sort of trying to change it because they see that as a soft power, because Buddhism is also increasing all around the world as well. And I've had personal, I've met monks who've actually escaped from Tibet like long time ago, not recently. But one of the main reasons they said was because they wanted to study more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of pointed out towards how there is lack of information or access to information inside Tibet, like the nuns you mentioned as well. So I was wondering if did you notice if the monasteries and in terms of your own knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism, which you seem to know quite a lot, would you say studying Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet versus studying Tibetan Buddhism outside Tibet, what would be the difference?
Well, I think there would be firstly greater resources available in India because there's a work of a man, actually an American Mormon, as it turned out, who was involved with preserving these container loads of Tibetan treatises and texts, and then digitalizing them. So I think in terms of access, if people are able to get a passport or make the trip or covertly go to India, there will be more access to things. The other aspects, I didn't see that much of imposition of Mandarin on the monasteries. That wasn't something that people would mention as a complaint to me. The difficulties are different. One, restricting the intake of young lamas and basically prohibiting all the people who want to study in a monastery from being able to go is a serious problem. The next problem, and this varies with policy because Chinese communist policies are inconsistently applied, is the pressure to study Xi Jinping thought and hours spent studying communist ideology rather than Buddhist texts and Tibetan culture. Now, this usually backfires spectacularly on the cadres when they don't have, a real hard grip on things, because you're talking to lamas who've studied dialectical debate, and they just chop up the communists on these things, but they've learned that's going to bring bad blowback. So you have that. And I think the third thing, which I understand is very controversial, I have no particular perspectives one way or the other on it as a concept, but the issue of the Shugden controversy is something that is pushed. Even in Ganden Monastery, there is there's been established a Shugden chapel that is guarded by PLA soldiers. And these guys made that dumpy woman cadre seem cool, because my friends and I, we speak Chinese. We could hear what they were saying about us, and it wasn't really nice at all. We kind of made a point of pointing that out to them. But you have, and this varies with time, an emphasis upon Shugden, and at times, certain places, a anti-Guru Rinpoche policies being pursued, which seem to have no consistency. But it seems to be how can you be an atheist and say, okay, I'm going to use Shugden and that whole controversy to impugn the Dalai Lama, right? It's like you can't even talk coherently about Marxism, which is an incoherent philosophy. Why are you dabbling in this stuff? So those are the things that come to my mind in terms of the challenges. I recall the Lhasa bookstores, very little in Tibetan, most in Chinese, and most innocuous in terms of Buddhism, books that seem to have been written by foreigners who are, I call, California Buddhists. Which is the other thing I discovered in terms of bringing, gifts. The best thing you can bring, books. Wrap them in like the cover to Xi Jinping thought. Use that dust cover to hide them, so you can just get right through. And then here you go. And boy, that was fun. Just helping to plant seeds. But yeah, those are my feelings. I mean, again, I don't want to sound like that I'm unaware of the brutalic idiocracy that goes on. I am. But in some ways, I pity the Chinese communists because they don't know what they're dealing with, how tough Tibetans are, and how, maybe I view things that way because I'm part Polish and sort of thinking of Russian in those terms. But, Poland's still around, Armenia is still around, East Timor is still around, and Tibet will continue to be, despite all the cruelty.
Thank you so much, Michael. And the quote you read at the end was also very beautiful, very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. All right, guys. Well, as I said, if I can be of help in other things, career development, I can give someone a song, chapter and verse about why or why not to be a lawyer. If any young Tibetans are interested, guys are interested in doing that, or other things, I'm happy to help. I'm delighted that you guys reached out to me, and I consider you to have really honored me by doing so. So give me a chance to pay you back.
Yeah, I think you're a very huge resource for us, and we would definitely get back to you, and you have plenty of things to learn from. And I'm definitely going to read the book again. Sorry.
Okay, great.
Yes, and
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, guys. Well, I guess we'll
Does
draw to
anyone else wanna?
Maybe just go. I'll let others just few. Michael, do you still have some time
Yeah,
to take some few
please.
questions?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, hey, hi.
Yes.
Hi, I just realized all of our first names are Tenzin, which is very confusing.
Yeah,
Uh, so similar to Tundi, I was brought up in the exile, and I consume a lot of kind of insights or even media or content about Tibet or Lhasa through secondary sources. And one question I do have for you is about kind of the Tibetan language. Like,
Mhm.
when you in your time there, was it possible for a Tibetan family who spoke only Tibetan to be able to navigate or have a good quality of life in Lhasa?
Mm.
I would say that I hadn't seen anyone of that. The people that I would meet would be working, I'm thinking in terms of people who run shops, work in hotels, people who are drivers, people who are guides, um, people who are what I would say of restaurants of middle class status would invariably have Mandarin and English. So I think it's sort of unavoidable for the ticket to the middle class. It's both you get three languages to be able to conquer. That's the other. The Canadian government long ago prepared a series of textbooks for teaching English as a foreign language for Tibetan students.
Mm.
I brought those on a USB and gave it to my guides, and those things I think went out everywhere. But I think that's the reality. If one doesn't speak English, then everyone I met spoke Mandarin in Lhasa. Um, if one didn't have English, they would be sort of in a secondary position, such as working as perhaps a waiter, perhaps as someone in a manufactory, as someone who's delivering groceries, as a driver for a guide who does speak English or Mandarin. So I think there's a heck of a challenge for someone to be able to advance without foreign language in living in Lhasa.
That's good to know. And in terms kind of let's call it Tibetan enclaves, like outside of the monastery, are there other parts of Lhasa that you feel are somewhat still kind of holding on strong to the old Lhasa?
Um, well, for the most part, that would be within that mile radius with the Jokong as a center. Now, there are other Tibetan enclaves which are for people higher in the social structure, which means ties with the party. And out to the west, there's a series of newly built Tibetan homes, Tibetan in quotes, that sort of imitates the appearance of the Lhasa houses, but not really. But they're hugely expensive. But there are these enclaves where those people, basically the upper classes, live. And then there'll be other places outside of Ba Pongka. There is a Tibetan enclave, but it's slowly being eaten up by development, new construction, and I think Chinese migration. Uh, to the far east of Lhasa, there is a new satellite city being built that is said to be the center for new higher education in Tibet. The boarding schools, I think that's what was told me. And these are modern architectural horrors, multi-story. You can picture, if you ever seen horrible architecture in Beijing, it's the same sort of thing. I have no idea if that is going to become a Tibetan enclave or not, but it's what's presented. Uh, Invariably, the countryside is fabulous. I was able to arrange in a one trip to visit my guide's village. It was like an hour and a half outside of Lhasa. Um, Surprisingly, approvals were easy. So we had, lunch with his mom, which was just fabulous. We brought little gifts and little pictures of Avalokita. It was just very nice. So my feeling is that in the villages where you have a prevalence of old housing, people are doing as well as they can. What you can't escape is everyone's house has a poster of Xi Jinping and the 4 other great luminaries of the CCP. That's in everyone's living room. And that's, well, enough said. I want to keep my language for this presentation to be family friendly.
Michael, just a question on the population of Lhasa. Do you see it's been increasing for the number of years you've been there? The population of Lhasa, because a lot nowadays, that's my understanding, Tibetans from outside of Tar are not easily able to come into Tar in terms of intermigration between all the different regions of Lhasa. How is that as a city either growing or diversifying?
Growing. It has this continual urban sprawl to the east and to the west. Now, the official statistics, if I remember them correctly, as if you're going to trust official statistics, but okay, let's pretend, says that Lhasa is 60% Tibetan, 40% Han Chinese. Those figures do not include the population of the PLA cantonments. So what the real figure is, my guess is probably less, maybe 50-50 or so. But the higher percentage of Chinese all invariably wind up in living in neighborhoods that never existed before 1959 and before 1990 in many ways. All of this is new construction. I forget the precise number of the population. I think I mentioned it in the epilogue of Old Lhasa. But certainly, the other impression I have is that while you have many Han Chinese going to Lhasa, they go there on 3-year contracts. Many on just 3-year contracts. Open-minded people in mainland China and Han China will say, yeah, that's the sort of people who go to Tibet. They're not our best. They go there for 3 years and they count every day until their contract expires. And certainly all their Tibetan colleagues are counting every day until their contract expires too, I bet. But it's while you have a large percentage, it is a floating population that often aspires to get out as soon as they can. Lhasa is a hardship posting to their way of thought.
It's funny, like what you shared about there's a thirst among Tibetans to exposure to international, and for us as Tibetans in the diaspora, we also have the thirst to first of all just visit Tibet, see Tibet. That's hopefully if a PRC or Chinese official ever watches this video, hopefully they will give visas at least to go and see, because I know many Tibetans, even seeing their parents who are passing away, it's the lack of compassion, even to see the dying families also. It's like, and hopefully they will be more open to it.
Well, my prayer is that at some point Chenrezig will reach out to Xi Jinping and he'll wake up in the middle of the night, realize what he's doing, see the light of Chenrezig, realize the pain he's inflicting, and suddenly reverse course. That would be, I don't want any harm to befall these people. I'd rather just have them realize the pain they've inflicted so that they can take better steps or steps to atone. That's hopeful, I know. A little naive as well, but I mean, I always bring out the simple fact that the teachings of compassion that exist in Tibetan Buddhism is also an aspect of Buddhism throughout China. That is an age-old virtue. And it's past time for the Communist Party to reach back towards that. But we'll see.
So, Michael, I'm sure you know, after COVID, again, it's very hard for me to get a visa, but Tibet has opened up after COVID for more tourists in comparison to its previous
Yes.
years. And you know, personally, I know people that have been to Tibet. I see a lot of you know, Indians, Bhutanese, parts of Nepalese also going to Tibet as a kind of tourism or religious tourism, and uh, and again, it's a pretty packaged experience. So there, you know, there's a travel agency that creates a package for you, and you know you're somewhat restricted in what you can do or can go to. So you know, as someone who has spent a significant amount of time and has done research, any tips on how to
Oh,
get
yeah.
a more authentic, more realistic, more critical experience as they tour Tibet?
Sure. First things first, you can tell the travel agency, this is what I want to do, as opposed to getting sort of their standard, off the shelf, here, take this tour, which is, bad. It's very underwhelming. So firstly, you can do your research in advance and put together your own itinerary and say, this is what I want to do. And if a travel agent says, well, we can't do this, then find another travel agent. I'd be happy to recommend guys who do this, frankly. Uh, and what I found is, of course, you have to find a Tibetan guide, because here's his chance to earn some decent money. And at the same time, it's an opportunity for him or her to go on a religious pilgrimage. They're really charged. They're really happy about that. So it winds up disinfecting the entire group that, okay, we're going on a pilgrimage. This guy's happy. The driver's happy. We're together. We're showing respect for Tibetan culture and religion. That's a real high. I mean, that's really nice. So Tibet, you can find guides, and I'm happy to recommend them, who will listen to people's preferences. And then it's an issue of doing your research in advance and requesting things that you wouldn't think would be possible. Like on my second, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, uh, I asked my guide, this is a shot in the dark, but can we go to your village? Uh, we get approvals for that? And we did. Um, these days, they've relaxed the rules so that Tibetan guides don't have to work through an agency or a company per se. They work as independent contractors, and they have the authority to apply for the travel permit. So that takes one layer of the middlemen out, which is good. Uh, and there seems to be a lot more flexibility in days of old. More places are open, I think. There are, what I found is that as a foreigner in Lhasa, I could probably go anywhere on my own. But once we left the city limits, I had to be in a car and drive with a guide and a car and driver. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Arriving at a place, you could go anywhere. And my favorite has been on many trips going to Yerpa Valley, which is a stunning place, well suited for a picnic, and just great monks who are very happy to receive people from the outside world. So yeah, you can blast past the 4 days in Lhasa, and this is what you're going to see, and it's underwhelming. You can dodge that for sure. The one problem these days for Indians is that because of relations between New Delhi and Beijing, Mount Kailash is off limits to them. People of Indian descent outside of India can take a pilgrimage there, but Indian citizens cannot.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, and at the end of my slides, I have my email address. If you come up with other questions later on, you know, we didn't get to today, just shoot them to me. I'd be happy to answer. You know, don't be shy.
Thank you.
Sorry, we might be concluding to the end of the talk. Just wanted to give a last minute, any last question from Ingmala, who just joined, or Scott, Rignam.
Hi, this is Migmar.
Hello.
Hi. Just wanted to say thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Oh, my
And
pleasure.
it was wonderful to listen to you and your raw experience in Tibet. As a young Tibetan who was born and brought up outside of Tibet, like you said in your slides, the identity crisis that we have is just being born Tibetan enough, or you have to learn your language, your history, and all that. It comes to me. This thought comes to me all the time, and this is also the reason that I came in to join this meeting. Also, to hear about the land that I've never been to, but where my ancestors are from, and hearing your experience was extraordinary, and also the insights that you just shared minutes ago. Also, just plus point on your slides, your humor is very nice.
Oh, thank you.
It was very entertaining throughout. Although I didn't get to listen to you in the beginning, I just joined halfway through, but it was all good. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you. Oh, thank you so much. And I appreciate that my sense of humor appeals to you. The other half of me is Irish, so I can't resist this sort of Irish mischievous mockery of authority. And seeing the CCP in China, in Tibet, there's a lot of room for humor. It's essential
Definitely.
trait,
Yeah.
essential way to make learning more fun as well, I find.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I think so. That's one of the one key reason I really loved your book is you have this like both folklores, fables, stories, and mix of humor. It makes it much more, as you said, more interesting to learn, and it's the first step, right? Like it's because sometimes there are books which is very heavy.
Yep.
But this one, it helps, I think, so to get the first step, first take, and then you can go further in more comprehensive reading.
Exactly. That was my objective, is to sort of be like, you know, some guy in an English pub, you know, or an old storyteller somewhere on the Bacor, you know, weaving these stories and then, you know, inspiring people to say, you know, this is fascinating, and I have to have a fun version before I can really dive into the real heavy stuff. So, okay, well, first steps, make it fun, make it interesting. And make it something, you know, it's benefited my life so much. So, okay, well, let me try to pay back in some way.
Think so that might be and so I wish I had so this is my virtual kada for Michael. So if ever we meet in person, I would love to give another kada and a big hug for
Please.
writing this book, for taking your time and effort to get into detail into each site. It's very fascinating. So thank you very much, Michael, and I hope there'll be more books. As you mentioned, there are lots of stories that has either been left out or that we would want to build into a future books. And your point about like the intellectual framework, like for me as an exile, as a Tibetan living in the West, we, like His Holiness says, being in exile has given him the opportunity to share Buddhist teachings, compassion. And I think so at the same level for Tibetans also in exile, we have the luxury and freedom to absorb new ideas, engage with different knowledge, and that will both strengthen our history, our understanding on Tibet, and how we see the futures. And I think so. Your point is very much a useful frame to think for Tibetans outside Tibet, and hopefully one day we'll be able to meet our brothers and sisters back in Tibet. So
Yes.
thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you. And you're very welcome. This has been a wonderfully meaningful discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll have a video of this talk, which will be shared online, and hopefully that will create more conversation, more interesting questions from your presentation today.
Very good. I hope so. All right.
Thank
To
you.
to be continued.
To be continued. Thank you, Tochiche. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you
All
so
right.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Bye. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Good night.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.